Hello everyone, it's me, Miss Parish, and this is our very first lecture video. So before I start, I just want to say welcome to English 122 again. If you haven't watched my other two videos already, you need to go to our course homepage. On that page there is a video where I kind of give a brief overview of the class and explain the syllabus a little bit. And then I also have a video that kind of navigates the site and shows you how to get to everything. But if you're here watching this video, then I assume that you've been able to navigate it pretty well and have come to this video to watch, and I'm glad. So since this is an online class, this is the first year I'm doing this, I am going to do some online videos for lecture. In the past I have not done that, and I just thought that this might be a better way to kind of communicate the terminology in our textbook and to talk about different videos and things that we watch. So I hope that it goes well. This first video is going to go over the very first part of fiction. It's going to go over in our Discovering Literature book, which I have right here. If you don't already have this book, you need to get it because all of the stuff I'm talking about today is in here. So in this book, I'm going to be going over chapters 1 through 4. It's not going to be a long video, hopefully. And it should help to kind of go over the terminology and maybe help it to sink in better than just reading it on the page. Alright, so I'm basically going to review this PowerPoint here, and hopefully my little video here in the corner won't cut off anything. But so yeah, this is part 1 of, I labeled it fiction because our book calls it fiction, but our first paper in this class is either fiction or nonfiction, or you have some options with it, but this is just part 1, chapters 1 through 4. So we'll get started. Go here. Alright, so in chapter 1, which is the preview chapter, it starts actually on page 26 in our book. And my best way to go through lecture is that I want to kind of cover some big points. Obviously, I'm glossing over these concepts and we're talking about them in a little more depth. But our textbook, I really like the Discovering Literature book. It outlines everything so well, I think, and gives you guys so many examples. And you'll notice with this textbook that most of it are stories. 90% of this textbook are example stories. So if you need an example to back yourself up, or if you're doing an assignment that requires you to read a story in the book, this one it's really good. I like this textbook a lot, even though it has aged slightly. It's probably about 14 years old. So it's got a little age on it, but it's still very good. So anyway, chapter 1 is the preview for fiction. And it starts out by asking us what we need to do when we interact with prose. And I say prose because that could be fiction, nonfiction, any form of short story. And they give us, if you look at page 27, they give us these different little bullet points that are here on your screen. I'm going to kind of go over them with you all real quick. The first one obviously is to read with an open mind. Unless you read up on the author or know them well enough through their other stories, it can be hard sometimes to figure out what the author is meaning with the text until we read it all the way through. So, excuse me. Usually, if I start reading a story, I try to keep an open mind, even if I'm not liking it initially. I'll be like, okay, I'll read it and see what happens. And then afterwards, I usually can formulate my thoughts and say, oh no, this was bad because of such and such, or no, this was great because of reasons A, B, or C. The second point here is to read a story more than once. Excuse me, this is usually the hardest for students because I'm right there with you. We only have so much time in a day. And I apologize, my throat is dry. We only have so much time in a day, so reading a story more than once is often challenging and can be hard to do, but especially with these short stories and for the ones for our discussion forum, I would at least encourage you to read them twice, only because I know that reading it the second time is going to give you more information. And I'm going to get a drink, so hold on. Alright, got my Kool-Aid. I'm ready to go. Alright, so the third thing is to use your imagination, which I have younger cousins and I always think of SpongeBob, where he does the use your imagination. I always think of that episode. But in all reality, even fiction that's traditional and about very realistic stories, you have to be creative with that. You have to think up characters and setting and all the elements that we're going to talk about. And you can't really do that unless you have an imagination. And you kind of have to have an imagination to envision some of the things that these stories talk about too. So that's a pretty key component. Allow your emotions to come into play as well. I would say that with nonfiction and poetry especially, this is important because your emotions can dictate whether you like something, whether you dislike it, how you react to it, how you connect to it. We see a lot of these different stories, especially stuff based on comic books, for example, have such a big fan following because people allow their emotions to connect to the characters and the plot and the story. I mean, think of Black Panther that recently came out and the giant movement that's connected with that and how many people resonate with it. There's a reason for that. And I think that when people allow their emotions to come into play, it helps give a more dynamic and richer experience than if you just read something and you don't take anything away from it. And then finally, try to get the sense of a story as a whole. So it can be easy when you start reading a story and you're like, oh, this doesn't make sense. What are they trying to do with this? I don't understand it. But when you go back after you've read the whole thing and say, okay, what was the author's intent? Why did they do this? Then it can be a lot clearer. So, and then also think about your reactions. Why do you react to things the way that you do? And this can be one of the hardest things to do as a reader, is say, okay, well, I didn't like that. Why? What about me didn't like that? And that not only informs yourself about things that you like and why, but it can also improve your writing when you're trying to analyze something and say, okay, well, why is it bad? Don't just say it's bad. Why is that? And when you think about your reactions, that can help give you an answer to those questions. And then finally, talk with other readers. That's kind of the whole point of our discussion forum. We have that discussion forum so that you can talk to each other about what we read. And that's sort of why I said in the last video that I did about the discussion forum, I don't want to just see you guys say, oh, that was great, I liked it. You know, tell me why. Why did you like it, or why did you dislike it? Why do you agree with your peers? Creating that dialogue and that conversation is going to keep our discussion forums from getting boring and also allow us to have a better conversation about the story, because I picked these stories for this class for a reason, because I think that you all will connect with them in different ways or find something fundamentally good or fundamentally weird about it that we can talk about. So those are the reasons that they list in our book on page 27 and 26, and they give a little bit more exposition with them, but that's generally it. So moving on. The 7 elements of fiction is the heart of this chapter, and they are listed here. I tried to summarize them up in terms of questions that we as the audience would ask about them. So with setting, where are we and when are we? Because setting is not just about the location, it's also about the time period, which I think a lot of people writing stories can get caught up with. They're saying, oh, it's at a house, but where is that house? What city is it in? What time period is it in? Does everything match up? And audience members and readers can pick up on that fairly quickly. If we see something out of place, if we say, oh, it's in Harrisburg, Illinois is the setting, but you see a spaceship land, you're like, okay, well, the time period can't be 2018, it has to be somewhere in the future. So that's a pretty crucial criteria. Where is your story and what time period? Also, our second element is very important, and that are the characters. Who is in this story? And who doesn't necessarily have to mean human. If you're looking at a story like Beauty and the Beast or Brave Little Toaster, again, I have younger cousins, so I watch a lot of cartoons. But, you know, those characters aren't necessarily human. They're inanimate objects that have been personified or given human qualities. So they are characters, and you can also look at nature as being a character too, especially in stories where there's one human character. Usually it's man against nature, or a character against a force of nature, and that force of nature is its own character. So we have to consider it like that. but they're the people that we kind of connect with as audience members, and that means that they're very important. If your characters are not good, your audience isn't really going to find a reason to feel compelled to keep reading your story because they don't really care what happens to those people that are in it. And the same goes with plot. What happens? The plot of a story can be extremely simple. It can be a guy walks to his mailbox and back, and that's it. Or it can be like Lord of the Rings, where it's 3 novels and this epic journey, and there's all these subplots and subthreads of what happens in the story. It can be as simple and complex as you want. The point of view is tied to our character and our plot, meaning who tells the story, who is the focus of the story, and what kind of viewpoint do we get as we read. And we'll go over more about that later. Symbolism, what in the story has extra meaning? Meaning, is there some kind of layer of meaning behind names or colors, or we'll go over more of that later too. And then theme. Does the story make you think? What is its point? And I would say that can be one of the most complex or simple things about the story. Is it just a story about a kid growing up and that's it? Or does it have multiple themes and multiple complex purposes that the author is trying to get across to the audience? And then style is, how does the author use language? Is it simplistic? Is it complex? Is it confusing or vague? We're going to go over all of these different elements separately. Mainly today we're going to be going over these 3. And then in the next video I'm going to go over the other 4. But your story, in order for it to be good, has to have all 7 elements. Now, these 7 elements do not have to be equally represented. Your story can have a very minimal setting, but very dynamic and complex characters. It can have a simple plot and a simple style, but have a huge inner theme behind it. I mean, these don't all have to be balanced, but a good story will have a good element of each of these. And so I think that's pretty important, and we'll go over more of these in depth as we go along. So this chapter is the preview chapter, and it gives us an overview of all of the elements. It doesn't go in depth with any of them, but it gives us an overview and gives us a few different little terms to kind of play with and think about before we dive into the chapters themselves. So with setting and character, they give us these 2 terms, narrator and dialogue. Narrator is obviously the person or entity telling the story, and different narrators depend on different points of view. Apologize. The dialogue, on the other hand, which I cannot do today, excuse me, are the verbal exchange between characters. So, excuse me, when I was in a creative writing class in college, our creative writing instructor would tell us, when we were creating conversations, to go out to a coffee shop or a restaurant or a grocery store or wherever, and she would tell us, Miss Carmen would say, go and listen to how people talk and write it down. And it felt like the most eavesdropping, stalkerish thing to do, but it was so helpful, because when you read stories of how people talk, sometimes authors get notorious for having dialogue that doesn't really match a real conversation. So, for example, Stephen King is a great writer. I mean, there's a reason that he's famous for his books, but a lot of people note that his dialogue is often not exactly how people talk in real life. It's very stylized and very novel-esque, which makes sense because that's what it is. But when they translate it to film, a lot of times that dialogue doesn't necessarily work, and the screenwriters have to kind of play with it and change it to where it will work for a movie setting. So some of the dialogue in the new movie It, for example, has been changed from the textbook because it doesn't sound as good in film form as it did in text form. So that's just one example. But yeah, my creative writing teacher, she was all about us listening to how people actually talk, because when you do, you find out that people have mannerisms and people say things. It's similar to your friend, maybe you have one that says like all the time. They go, well, like, it's just like this. And some people get very distracted by that and find it agitating, but that's just their dialect, their conversation. And so this example dialogue here is just how you would write that out. So for example, I have, she turned to him, her face tense. What do you want? He seemed surprised. Don't you know who I am? I do, her eyes narrowed, but I don't know why you're here. This is how you would write dialogue in your paper, for example, if you're going to use it for this first paper. And you'll note that before each dialogue, which is in quotation marks here, that I do include a little comma. And that's important. Even if you break up the dialogue, even if you start the dialogue and then you say something about the character and then you continue the dialogue, you always use commas. And so if you want to, go back to this slide and look at how this dialogue is formulated, because that's how I'm going to want it if you decide to use it in your paper. And we'll talk more about paper 1 at the end of this presentation. All right. As far as plot goes, there are two big terms here with plot and point of view. One is suspense, which we know is a form of storytelling in which you hold the reader's attention through mystery and intrigue. And that's mainly a way of keeping the reader's attention, is that they withhold information or they keep you from seeing information until a certain point in the story. And there's a reason for that. It builds tension. It builds action towards the climax, which we'll talk about later. The other thing is the use of point of view, which is, as in our book quotes it as, through the eye, whose eyes are we looking at the world? And this 37 here means it's on page 37 in our book, which I'm going to be using throughout this presentation, MLA citations, the form of which here, this is an in-text citation, and we'll talk about MLA next week. But this is an in-text citation, how it would look if I was quoting the book in a paper or a presentation. So just to give you a heads up of why that 37's there. There are 3 types of point of view, which you probably remember from high school and 121, but I will go over them again here just as a refresher. First person point of view. It's a very selfish point of view. It's all about me, or I, or we, or us. It is telling it from that character's point of view. The example I think of the most and have seen the most papers about is that of the Hunger Games. Katniss, if you've read the Hunger Games, the story is told through Katniss's point of view. That is first person. Second person is the least used of all the point of view, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Third person, we see a lot, it's he or Jane, or they use names. It's as if the story is told from a character's point of view, but not from the character themselves. So Harry Potter, for example, is a third person point of view story. It's not told from Harry's point of view. We just kind of follow Harry along like a fly on the wall and see all these things and interact with him. A second person point of view is the least used because it's very awkward. It's very confrontational. Chuck Palahniuk, who wrote Fight Club, if you ever read his work, he writes a lot in second person point of view because his goal as a writer is to intimidate you and to make you feel uncomfortable and weird as you read the story. So he has a story, for example, where a woman goes into massage therapy school and it turns out to be this underworld of assassins, and it's a very weird story, but he writes it in second person point of view, so then as you read it, you are the woman going to the massage therapy school. So he says, you do this, you interact with this person, then you think this. And as a reader, it can be unsettling because you're thinking to yourself, no, I don't feel these things, or no, I don't want to do these things. And so it can be very off-putting. So a lot of times we don't see second person used. It's usually first or third person. But those are the differences between the two of them. And then we have an overview of symbolism, which, as I said earlier, are things that have meaning beyond themselves. If an author is trying to create a richer context within their story, they may use things like colors or names or tie to mythology, whether it be, you know, a specific culture's mythology, to try to create extra meaning in the story. So, for example, go back to Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling is if you read Harry Potter, you will figure out very quickly that she goes and uses a lot of Roman and Greek mythology. She uses a lot of colors, and her names all have meanings, and there's all these ties to different symbolism, and it's all to help give the story a better context and a more richer experience, so that as you're reading, you're thinking to yourself, okay, what does that name mean? What does it say about their character? And it makes you think beyond just what the plot is of the story, which gives a lot of repeat value if you're reading something. If you read a story and it's really basic and there's no symbolism, then you read it once and you're like, well, I got everything. What else is there to know about it? But if it has symbolism, then you can talk with others about what things mean, and you can keep the conversation about the story going, and it has a better staying power in your mind because you're constantly thinking about what certain things mean, right? And we'll talk more about symbolism in the other video and how it's used, but that's kind of the idea of it. It just gives meaning, extra meaning to parts of the story, whether it's a character's name, or it's the color of clothes they wear, or if it's an item that they carry with them. So, and then theme. What is the meaning of the story as a whole? What's the purpose the author has given to it? Texture is a web of revealing details or significant dialogue. It's very similar to symbolism and theme in that it creates a richer, more in-depth story that has more complexity and can be read multiple times and doesn't get old, things like that. And then there are two types of reading a story. There is your first impression and what's called a running commentary. And a running commentary is where, as you read, you make notes and observations. So let's take this presentation that you are watching right now. If you were doing a first impressions view of it, you would watch this entire thing, you'd read the entire PowerPoint, and you would not do anything until after it was over. And then you'd have your impression as a whole. That's what first impressions means. You read a story and then you think about it. Running commentary is very similar to when you watch people do commentaries for movies or video games or things like that. As they're watching, they are making observations and taking notes. So there are benefits, pros and cons to both styles. The pro of first impressions is that you get to see the entire thing as a whole and you don't think about it, you just watch it as it is or read it like it is, and then you can start to unravel it. And there's a benefit to that. But then on the other side, with running commentary, you don't forget anything. As you're thinking, you're writing stuff down. The con of running commentary is that because you're so busy making observations and taking notes, you might miss something, or you may not get that sense of a whole as you read it. So there's pros and cons to both styles of taking notes, either just watching it and then talking about it, or doing it as you watch. It kind of depends on what type of learner, what type of writer you are, whether or not things, which style works better. I'm more of a running commentary person. I kind of like to make notes and observations as I watch, otherwise I might forget something. But sometimes I have done the first impressions approach, where I'll just sit there and I'll read something or I'll watch something and then talk about it. And there are benefits. It just kind of depends on what you're reading and what style of writer you are. Alright, and then finally in this chapter, the last thing they talk about are types of brainstorming. And on page 53 in our textbook, you will see a sample cluster in your book, and I'll kind of hold it. Yeah, it's this little thing, looks like the Blair Witch Project. That is a sample of a clustering technique. And the idea is that you're just trying to tie things together in a story and think about how they all relate. Now, I mentioned in our first video on our course homepage that the Wadsworth Handbook, which I'm about to show you a picture of, this textbook right here. Yeah. If you already have this textbook, go ahead and keep it this semester. If you don't have this textbook, it is not the end of the world if you get it or not. This textbook is really good if you struggle with grammar, or if you want to know brainstorming techniques, for example. This book has a whole section on brainstorming, and it's awesome. I love it. But aside from helping with grammar and brainstorming and checking your sentence structure, things like that, this book is not the best. So the MLA in it is outdated, which is why I don't prefer it. But if you already have this textbook from 121, then just keep it and get rid of it at the end of the semester. If you don't have it, don't worry about it. But they do have a nice section on brainstorming, which I've noted on here. And then a capsule portrait is something that a lot of creative writing instructors will recommend that you do if you're writing a short story or anything involving creating a character. And that is, you create your character, you list how they look, their personality, their likes, their dislikes, their philosophy, how they think about the world, and it's just you create this profile of this character you've created. And the idea is that this portrait helps you as the writer understand your character's motivations so that when you use them in the story, it makes more sense and it's easier to do. So that's just an exercise. Our Paper 1 guidelines are online right now. They're in our Syllabus, Handouts, and Videos tab online, and you'll see that one of your options for Paper 1 is that you can write a short story. It's one of our more creative writing options if you want to. You don't have to, it's just an option. But if you are going to choose that option, I would recommend that you do a capsule portrait of your character in the story, because I think that will help you figure out what your character's motivations are, which will make writing the story easier. All right, so that's chapter 1. These next 3 chapters we're going to look at, chapters 2, 3, and 4, are not essentially long chapters in terms of terminology. They have lots and lots of story examples, as I've said before. So if you're wanting an example story to match these terms we're about to talk about, then these chapters have you covered. So chapter 2, setting, starts on page 55. And really, these are the big things, the big terms that have to do with this story. The types of setting that we have. We have 4 types of setting that most stories fall into. Type 1 is called a mirror setting, and that's where the setting reflects the mood of the story or the character's mood. So I put, for example, a desert, the desert, as your example, not the pastry, but the actual arid, sandy desert. If a character's stuck in the desert, typically that means that they have a sense of despair, maybe, of isolation. A lot of times in stories, you see maybe a character stuck in the rain. Rain usually signifies what? That they're having a bad mood or a bad day. That's typically what you would see in those types of stories. I think of the new Blade Runner that came out. There's a scene where Ryan Gosling's stuck in the rain and it's pouring on him and he just has this look of despair. That would be setting as a mirror because it shows what the character is thinking. You also have the idea of characters being influenced by setting as a mold. This would be a prison, for example. A prison doesn't necessarily represent the mood, but it shapes the characters within it. So, for example, if you've watched shows like Orange is the New Black, you would see that the characters, their personalities and their actions start to get motivated or changed based on the fact that they're in prison, and that prison kind of limits their options or makes them have to choose certain circumstances that they're in. That would be an example of that. And then you have setting as escape. This one's probably not the most common, but is a setting that would take a character to an imaginary or dreamlike place. So Alice in Wonderland is probably my favorite example of this because the setting is so bonkers and weird. It's definitely an escape from the rigid Victorian world that Alice lives in at the start of the book. And then finally you have setting as alien. Now I put space on here. That doesn't necessarily mean space. It just means that the setting represents a loss of home or the unknown. So a lot of times when we see movies set in space, that setting is definitely alien because the characters don't know where they are, but it doesn't have to be that way. It can just be an unknown location that they're stuck in and they have to deal with the fact that they're not familiar with that setting. So these 4 types of setting are going to be on your fiction exam when you take it, so please make sure you note those, the 4 different kinds. Most of these terms that I'm talking about are going to be in some shape or form on your exam, so just make note of those. We do have 4 exams in this class. We have one for fiction, poetry, drama, and MLA. They're not long exams. They're each worth 25 points, which is not a huge deal in comparison to the rest of the class as a whole, but I definitely want you to make a good grade on those exams. So definitely keep notes of this as you go. Now, they talk about dialogue, and they start to connect our setting to our characters. A stream of consciousness is where a story goes from place to place rapidly, sometimes without organization, like a dream. So again, Alice in Wonderland is an excellent example of stream of consciousness setting. The setting in that story is so varied and weird that at times you're like, where am I? And that's kind of the author's point, is that it is supposed to seem like a dream where you go from place to place very quickly. The opposite is true of an interior monologue, which we'll talk about interior monologues a lot in our drama section. But the idea here is the story takes place in the character's mind. So the character sees impressions, reminisces, half-formulated thoughts and ideas. It can be dreamlike, but we as the audience know it's happening in their head. Whereas in Alice in Wonderland, we think maybe it's an interior monologue, but we're not entirely sure. It's never really established whether it's a dream or not, right? Depending on the version of Alice in Wonderland that you see. So yeah, those are two types of settings that take place kind of out of the norm. They're not very typical settings, whether they're in the character's mind or they seem like a dream. Alright, so that's chapter 2, setting. Like I said, very short chapters. Lots of stories, examples. Character is a very short chapter as well. It's really just one slide here, which is funny because character is one of the most important aspects of fiction. Your characters are often what people gravitate towards. I've read tons of stories where people were like, yeah, the plot is okay, but the characters are awesome. And so that's why I think that they're one of the most important elements, is that you want a character that's relatable and something that we root for, because as you're reading, if you don't care about who's involved in the story, then why bother reading it, right? There are two types of characters that our story talks about, and character in our book starts on page 90. The two types of characters are round and flat. Round characters are exactly as they sound. They are three-dimensional. They have complexity. They have personality. They have motivation. They have depth to them. We know what they look like. We can envision in our heads what they sound like through their dialogue. We know so much about them that they seem like they could be real. And a lot of times a very good protagonist, which we'll talk about in a minute, will be a round character. So you want your main character in the story, or the main couple of characters, to be round, to have that kind of complexity to them where you can kind of see them as real people. As opposed to flat characters, which are our background characters. They are often not necessarily stereotypical, but they're generalized, they're one note, they don't really have a lot of depth, they're just kind of there, right? I would argue that sometimes villains can be very flat. They just have one motivation, and that's to, rule the world, and they aren't very rounded. A good character, whether it's an antagonist or a protagonist, or a main character or a side character, will be rounded. They'll have that complicated dynamic within them. Flat characters you just kind of see once and you're like, ah, there they are. In Beauty and the Beast, when Belle walks through the town, she sees like the baker and the bookstore owner. Those are all flat characters. We know what their names are, and we know that they have a job. That's about all that they're good for. But characters like Belle and the Beast and Maurice, they're rounded. We understand their motivations and who they are as characters, and that helps us to relate to them as the story goes on. Initiation is what's called a rite of passage in a story. It takes the character from one point to the next. I've heard a lot of times that people complain that a bad story will have a character that starts off in one point and ends in the exact same point. And that's not what you want, right? And usually an initiation has to happen to get the character to move from point A to point B, right? So again, I have small children, so bear with me. But Finding Nemo, in that story, the rite of passage is the shark bait hoo-ha-ha scene where the other fish kind of let Nemo into their group. That's kind of a rite of passage because it breaks Nemo out of his shell from being an only character where his dad has kind of shut him off from the rest of the world into this new community where he can interact with these characters that are different, but he's not scared of anymore. If that makes sense. Another example would be in The Lion King, where Simba, it is visually represented to us with him passing on that log and growing up. his rite of passage is him kind of growing up as a character, and when he walks up on the rock at the end of The Lion King in the rain, that's his rite of passage. He's not just a teenager anymore, he's like leader of the pride and all of that. So there's lots of examples, and our book talks about it as well, but that's what initiation is. It's just a rite of passage to a character from one point to the next. Persona we'll see a lot in this textbook talked about. It is a hidden personality, a character who masks who they really are throughout the story, and usually we only find out their true intentions or their true personality towards the end. And this is it's what's called a trope. And a trope is something that happens in a story over and over again. So a big trope in literature or in movies is that this character has a persona where you think you know who they are, and then by the end you're like, oh no, they're totally not who they said they were. And it's usually a device that's created to give suspense or intrigue or a twist to the story. And then the last term here is minimalist, a character that is very simple with only the essential traits for the story. And you don't see this very much because minimalist does not imply complexity. And as we've said above here, a rounded character is what we want. So why would we need a minimalist character if that's kind of conflicting with this idea here? My example would be the character of Mad Max. In Mad Max Fury Road, the character of Max is very minimal. We know who he is. We know a little bit about his backstory if you watched the original Mad Max. But if you watched Fury Road, you really just know that this guy's name is Max, and that's it. Does that make it a bad story? No. But his character is minimal because we're kind of supposed to be in the same shoes as that character. We follow Max around, and he kind of represents us. We learn as we go what this character is doing. And that's very deliberate by the writer. They want us to kind of see things through Max's point of view. And so it's okay that he's minimalist because there's all this crazy other stuff going on that is complex that kind of balances out that minimalism. So Mad Max would be a good example of that. You could probably think of some other characters that are very simplistic but are part of a grander, bigger story. And that's okay. You want to be careful with minimalism though, because if you don't do it right, it can come across as flat, and that's not what you want. All right? Simple enough, right? So that's the chapter on character. And as we go through these other chapters, you'll probably see that a lot of these different elements kind of blend together and kind of go from one towards the other. Because I've been talking about point of view, and I've been talking about style, and you'll notice that they kind of all blend together. They're just separated with little distinctions. And that's okay. Like I said, if you have all 7, it makes a good story. So, chapter 4, the plot. It starts on page 134. And we're going to watch this scene in this video. And the very first term that we really get with plot is exposition. And exposition is a piece of information or pieces of information that the audience needs to know about the world that this story is taking place in. And of all the stories I can think of in recent memory that I think has one of the best pieces of exposition, it's probably Pirates of the Caribbean. And I know it's not technically a novel or a story, but it did start as a screenplay before it was filmed. So someone did write this all down. So we're going to watch this scene. It's only a couple minutes, and I want to make note of it.
You, Sparrow. Aye? You are familiar with that ship, the Black Pearl?
I've heard of it.
Where does it make berth?
Where does it make berth? Have you not heard the story? Captain Barbosa and his crew of miscreants sailed from the dreaded Isla de Muerta. It's an island that cannot be found except by those who already know where it is.
The ship's real enough. Therefore its anchorage must be a real place. Where is it?
Why ask me?
Because you're a pirate.
And you want to turn pirate yourself, is that it?
Never. They took Miss Swan.
Oh, so it is that you found a girl. I see. Well, if you're intending to brave all, hasten to her rescue and so win fair lady's heart, you'll have to do it alone, mate. I see no profit in it for me.
I can get you out of here.
How's that? The keys run off.
I helped build these cells. These are half-pin barrel hinges. With the right leverage and the proper application of strength, the door will lift free.
What's your name?
Will Turner.
That would be short for William, I imagine. Good strong name. No doubt name for your father, eh?
Yes.
Well, Mr. Turner, I'll change my mind. If you spring me from this cell, I swear on pain of death, I shall take you to the Black Barrel and your bonny lace to be having a court. Agreed. Agreed. Get me out.
Hurry, someone would have heard that.
Without my hand.
So yeah, okay. We learned so much in this 2-minute scene about everything involved in this world, right? So from the very get-go, we learn, we learned so much about these characters. I'm going to turn the all right, we learned so much about these characters just from this 2-minute scene. We learned about Jack, about his priorities. We learned about William, Orlando Bloom's character. We learned about how Jack is clearly interested in his name and who he is. We learned about Will's skill set. We learned about the Black Pearl. We learned about the curse. We learned about lots of things in this 2-minute moment. And that's all exposition. That is exactly its purpose. And if you watch interviews with the people who created the Pirates of the Caribbean, they note that Johnny Depp's character, when he was developing him, had him like sit on the ground and be in this weird pose because he thought exposition in a story is usually boring. People usually don't want to sit and hear all this plot detail. So he tried to find ways of making it interesting for us to watch. And I think he succeeded in that. But this scene right here, I think, is just a great example of plot, of exposition and action with a plot. It's just, I really like watching it. But that's an example just to think of. Our other terms with plot are from page 136. These are the two terms that I was talking about earlier, protagonist and antagonist. The protagonist is always the main character of the story, and the antagonist is always the character that keeps the protagonist from their goal. I will ask you a question on your final, and that question will be, the protagonist and antagonist are, and most students will get this wrong, because they will say that the protagonist is the good guy and the antagonist is the bad guy. That is not always the case. If you've seen any story like Megamind, Suicide Squad, anything like that, the protagonists are actually not good people, and the antagonist doesn't always even have to be a person. Like I said earlier in the presentation, the antagonist can be nature. It can be a force that's neutral in terms of whether it's good or bad. It's just the main character and the one trying to keep the character from their goal. That's it. There's no good, no bad, no adjectives thrown at it. So I will test you on that on the final, and hopefully you'll get that question right. Okay. There are two types of conflict in a story. There's either the external conflict or the internal conflict. Simple enough. External is anything happening within the world of the story, on the outside of things. Internal conflict, which I feel like all of us kind of know this term, is anything happening to us on the inside, within our minds, within ourselves. That's internal conflict. And external is everything happening on the outside. There's two types of narratives, too. Loose narrative and tight narrative. Loose narratives, they're stories that don't really have a structure. Everything just kind of meanders from one point to the next, meaning that a character kind of goes from situation to situation without really a meaning. I always think of Seinfeld. If you watch Seinfeld, it's a very loose narrative. There's not really a plot or a structure. Things just happen. It's famously the show where nothing happens. And then a tight narrative, though, is a story going from cause to effect. It goes from beat to beat. And that's like a series where stories go from one episode to the next. There's a clear plot and a thread of events happening that's in a sequential order. So that's the difference between loose and tight narratives. And then flashbacks, I feel like most of us know what a flashback is, and that is a break in the chronological sequence to show a character's past. We see that happen quite a bit. Now, plot terminology on page 137. And then 165, I know there's a lot of stories in here, so we jump around. We have what's called closure, which is the wrapping up or pulling together of the story. And closure I often compare to resolution, which is the ending of the story. And then there's the climax, which is the highest point of the action. And I've included this picture here because I think it perfectly encapsulates a narrative, how the plot should be. The plot starts here, where we set up our characters, we set up the situation, some conflict starts, whether it's internal or external. This inciting incident is the conflict that happens right here. And then the action rises and builds, and to the top point where we have our climax, our twist of the story, however the story reaches the ending, and then we get to our end. Now, you want this kind of structure, because if a story just goes in a straight line, it's going to be boring, right? But you also don't want to have too many of these loops, right? A lot of people complained in the last Lord of the Rings film, Return of the King, that once we got to this climax, the climax was way up here, and then our falling action took so long to get to the end. And that's a problem. Usually your resolution, I know it shows the resolution ending at the same place as the starting point, but a lot of times the resolution ends like right up here. It's just climax and then boom, we're at the end. Alright, so this is kind of the structure you want your story to have, although there can be a little variance there. And then that's pretty much it. That's it for these first 4 chapters. Like I said, there's lots of stories in between. Please read the guidelines for paper 1. They're on our handouts page, and this video will be in our week 1 of our video links page, also on the syllabus handouts and videos. And we're going to go over the other chapters in our next video, which will be available for week 2. You should be able to go ahead and watch it now. But those are the first 4 chapters, and I'll talk to you guys more about paper 1 in the next video. Alright? See you guys. Bye.